Good morning, great souls, and welcome. Welcome again to those joining us online. I'm reading today from Rays of the One Light. Awake, alert, attention. Get this right yet. Anyway, this is Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriya-yoga, based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. How should we meet our tests? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. Last week we considered Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness after his baptism by John. We discussed the question, does Satan exist? All of us experience temptation of one kind or another in our lives. Some of us frequently, others only occasionally. Whether temptation comes to us from our own subconscious or from outside ourselves is secondary to the fact that it does come and that we must deal with it. More important then is the question, how to deal with it. In fact, how to deal with tests of any kind. Martin Luther flung an ink pot at the devil who had appeared to test him. A dark stain on the wall of Luther's cell is pointed out to tourists in support of this story. Unfortunately, our trials are not often so summarily dismissed. As a fellow monk once said to Swami Kriya-yoga, speaking of Satan, "If only I could get my hands on him." Jesus, during his temptation in the wilderness, overcame them and thereby set an example for all time by clinging more determinedly to God. As Paramhansa Yogananda used to say, darkness cannot be driven out of a room with a stick. Once you turn on the light, however, the darkness will vanish as though it had never been. Jesus manifested this principle. The Bible tells us, therefore, that at last the devil leaveth him, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. In the Bhagavad Gita, the point is clarified further by the added explanation that there are three qualities in human nature: sattvic, or spiritually elevating, rajasic, or ego activating, and tamasic, or spiritually darkening. It is this triune aspect of human nature that the third chapter refers to with the words, "As fire is hidden by smoke, as a mirror is dulled by rust, and as an embryo is enclosed in the womb, so is the indwelling self enveloped by desire." Yogananda explained that each of these examples describes one of the qualities, or gunas. Sattva guna, that which elevates our consciousness, can be freed of any identity with ego by a little puff of meditation and right affirmation. Rajoguna, which embroils the ego in restless activity, can be worked off with a little more and a little longer effort. Tamoguna, embracing as it does such mental states as laziness and stupidity, can only be outgrown in time, since it inhibits even the desire for self-improvement. The example Jesus gave us was one intended more for those in whom sattva guna is predominant. But if you yourself find elements in your consciousness that resist even the effort to cling to God in prayer and meditation, don't despair. Patience, as it has been well said, is the fastest path to God. As long as your efforts take you steadfastly in the right direction, you will come out right in time. Remember Yogananda's words, "A saint is a sinner who never gave up." If, however, your nature impels you, even against your will, to move in the wrong direction toward egoic desires and away from God, strive at least to detach yourself mentally from your wrong actions, which are induced by habit. The time will come when their own stored up energy will tire and diminish. At that time, if you have not contributed to that energy by your consenting will, you will find it possible at last to redirect your energies more constructively. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om.
Meet our tests. We all have them. It's not as though we can escape them. They keep coming up of themselves. And I was reminded of a story about a philosopher named Seneca who lived at the end of the 1st century. And he lived in a suite of rooms above a gymnasium. And right on the street, open windows. They didn't have glass panes in those days, or double-paned windows, keep the noise out. So there were carriages rumbling across the stone roads. There were vendors hawking their wares. There was a carpenter across the street who was banging and sawing all day. And because there was a gymnasium underneath him, there were athletes dropping heavy weights on the floor all day long. And there was a swimming pool, so there were swimmers splashing and talking and, all these shouts, whistles blowing. And not only did he have this outward distraction of the cacophony of all these different sounds, but he was also in financial trouble because he had invested in overseas. Probably his ship sank instead of his ship coming in, which was a very big deal. And he had been a politician, and his enemies forced him out of politics. And he was on the outs with the emperor, which isn't a good thing to have happen. So he was, it would have been easy for him to be arrested and killed because of his differences with the emperor. So he mentioned to a friend of his that the noise was so bad that he began to, quote, hate his power of hearing. But then he said this to his friend, "But I have toughened my nerves against all that sort of thing. I force my mind to concentrate. All of the outdoors may be in bedlam, provided there is no disturbance within. When no noise reaches you, when no word shakes you out of yourself, whether it be flattery or a threat, or merely an empty sound buzzing about you with unmeaning sin, you may be sure that you are at peace with yourself." And of course, that reminds us of Yogananda saying, "Learn to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds." So we need to develop that kind of concentration, that ability to go inside, no matter what somebody just said that was insulting or whatever, just washes off. like a little duck. All the water just rolls off. There's another story. We've actually been listening to the audio book of C.S. Forester's Captain Horatio Hornblower. And I first read one of these books when I was a child. It was in my parents' library. So I really have always loved this character. And he is a naval officer in the British Army at the beginning of the 1800s. And he's fighting against the French, and who are also allied with the Spanish. So one of the things I love about this story is that early on, before he's a captain, he's captured by the Spanish, thrown into a Spanish prison. He's in there for 2 years. Most people would languish, give up hope. What does he do? He learned Spanish. So he's really good at Spanish, which comes in very handy in later years. But this particular story that I'm going to tell you is one of his adventures. There was an English boat that capsized and went to the bottom of the Mediterranean, deeper than divers could go. And it had a treasure of 250,000 pounds, a fortune, but nobody could get at it. So Captain Hornblower's superiors assigned him to, they said, nobody in the area even knows about this treasure. So it's near the Turkish countryside. It's desolate. There's hardly anybody there. There is a fort, but it's not manned. And I want you to go in there, retrieve the treasure using these special divers from Ceylon who are able to go to that depth. Recover the treasure, and don't make a diplomatic issue out of this. Do it very quietly and get out of there. So Hornblower goes, he's got the special divers, they find the treasure, they lift it up little by little. They're working at dawn, so it's very quiet. Nobody's seeing them. He has interactions with the magistrate there. It's all very cordial, and he really thinks he's done a good job. He's self-congratulating. He's gotten up 200,000 of the treasure. And this magistrate comes, and behind him is a huge boat. And this boat comes into this little bay, almost fills it up. And the magistrate says, "We have been watching every move that you made. And we know you have the treasure. You have 200,000 of it. And we propose that you now give it to us. And if not, we have this big boat, and the fort is manned, and another fort at the end of the strait is manned." He thought they were all empty. And, you and all your guys are going to get blown up. And he says, "I make a proposal to you, Mr. Hornblower, Captain Hornblower. I'll let you get the other 50,000, and you can have that. We'll just take the rest." Well, Hornblower is stalling for time, and he says, "Let me think about it, and come in the morning, and I'll give you my answer." So he has the night to think, and he goes up. These are boats with sails. He goes up climbs the ropes to the very top. He's looking at that fort way down this strait that he has to maneuver in order to get out. And he realizes that it's impossible to pass that fort because they'll just blow him to smithereens. And he clings to those ropes. He's in despair. There's no way. He's trapped. he can't get out of there. And he thinks, maybe the best thing for me is to let go of the ropes and just end this life. But he has such a sense of duty and so much innate courage that he decides, well, let me at least go down trying. And he remembers that across from the fort, there's a rock formation dividing the strait. And he studied, you got to do your homework. He's studied, so he knows that there's a very narrow passage between the shore and this rock formation. And if he can make that go through that way instead of where the fort is, he'll be able to get out. So what does he do? He tells all his men to be working in perfect silence, and they prepare the ship to sail. And I can't begin to tell you all the complicated things that they do. One of them is that they put a spring on the rudder so that they're facing, this big boat. But if they put a spring on the rudder, they can quickly move towards the escape. So they do all of this in perfect silence. And then, because he's prepared, I love this point too, because he's done everything he can think of to do, he's drawn grace. He doesn't think of it this way, but I do. He's drawn the grace that he feels a little breath of wind on his cheek. And he knows that if he jumps on that little breath of wind, he can get a head start on this big, massive boat, because he's got a little boat. And so he gives the order, still in silence. They let go and start moving. And by the time the big boat notices, they have a half a mile. And then, of course, the fort starts shooting cannons, and the boat starts shooting. And down the way, that fort starts shooting at them too. And he maneuvers through this, like this sushumna, this very narrow passage, out into free water, and he makes it. So creativity, courage, and doing everything we can when we come up against tests. We have to apply our creativity, and we have to draw through our magnetism that grace that will help us. If no breeze had come, he would have been stuck in the bay. But he put out so much energy, the universe responded. And lastly, we have a celebration of Krishna's birthday tomorrow night, 6:30. And so I've been reading stories about Krishna. That it's just wonderful. And this one is about Radha and Krishna. Krishna is challenged by his brother Balarama to ride this huge, ferocious bull that they have in Vrindavan. It's a stud bull. And this Taurian is just fierce. Nobody can even go near him. He's roped up. The keepers have to just sort of push some food to him because, he's so powerful. So Krishna says, okay, I will ride this bull. And so every day, Krishna goes to the bull and he plays his flute. And he gives the bull extra food, and pretty soon he's leaning against the bull, playing his flute. And the bull is liking the food, and he's liking the flute. And he does this every day for a month. It's like the sweetness of God's love, taming the wild senses, or whatever you want to think of. That's how I view it. So the day finally comes, and a couple days before, Balarama is saying, that was a stupid challenge. Please don't ride the bull. Please, I take it all back. It's too dangerous. And Krishna says, I'm riding the bull. So Balarama brings his other friends. They try to convince Krishna. He won't budge. So they say, Radha, please come and convince Krishna not to ride this bull. So Radha comes and she says, please, you can't do this. It's too dangerous. And he says, no, my mind is made up. And she said, then I'm riding it with you. And he says to her, aren't you too afraid? This is a huge monster bull. Aren't you too afraid to ride him? And she said, as long as I'm with you, I'm not afraid of anything. So he says, all right, hang on really tight. And they jump on the bull, who of course just gives them a wonderful ride out through the countryside. And they finally stop, and they make a garland of flowers for the bull. It's blissful. The bull is completely devoted to Krishna. And so the point of that story is to surrender and trust in God. When we have tests, which we all do, cling to God. Don't let go. Love God, be with Him, and all the tests will melt into a beautiful field of flowers, just as it did with that ride on the bull.
That story reminds me of, or the stories that Nirmala was telling reminded me of one that I hadn't been planning to tell, but seems appropriate. There was a friend of ours at Ananda, this is probably back in the mid-1980s, and she was a very energetic, very, very creative person, and very, very knowledgeable in a vast range of areas and topics. And she faced an illness that was one of these very stubborn, kind of chronic, it became chronic at a certain point. I mean, I don't know technically when an illness becomes chronic, but anyway, this had lasted for a month for her. And she tried everything she could think of. Allopathic medicine, alternative medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, homeopathy, astrology, tarot. I mean, she rolled the dice with everything she could possibly think of. And she was pretty expert in some of these areas. Nothing, no movement. The needle would not budge. And finally, I want to say this was probably like 1985 or so, because telephones had just come to the far side of the community, and Swami Kriyananda had a phone. And, people did not typically call him directly. I mean, usually they would call his secretary or whatever, but I mean, in this case, she just picked up the phone and called him. And he picked it up, and she explained the whole situation, Swami. This thing's been going on for a month, and I've tried X, Y, Z, and A, B, C. She ran out of letters in the alphabet for how many things she tried. And he paused for a moment, and he just said, it's just bad karma. And she was well the next day. And it was so interesting because she told this story not to sort of extol Swamiji or demean the efforts that she made, but sort of by way of just saying, you know, sometimes you've tried everything you can try. You don't know what else it's going to take. But just to be open to grace coming in, just to ask higher consciousness for guidance or for anything else. You know, it was sweet the way she described, and I can just hear Swami saying that, you know, it's just bad karma. And, you know, because it's not like you can add 40 more things to the effort that she had made. Sometimes you have given it your best, and that's all there that can be done. And then at a certain point, it does finally break. I brought this book up because I want to show it. God Alone. If any of you have not heard of it or read it, I highly recommend it. I swiped this copy from the boutique, and there's one more like it in there. That would be bad karma. The Life and Letters of a Saint. And Gyanamata was Yogananda's foremost woman disciple, one of his most advanced disciples of all. And she had a unique role in his organization back when it was hardly an organization at all. Or in fact, you could really say she had a role in his organization before it was an organization, because it was just a kind of a bunch of people trying to figure out what they're doing. But she guided the nuns, and she was older. She was 20 years older than Master. But at a certain point, and she also guided the whole work at Mount Washington while he was in India in 1935-36. She came to Yogananda in 1925, but she didn't move to California until about 1932. Anyway, around that time, it was not terribly long after that, she intuited, she was a highly advanced soul, she intuited that a great test was coming her way. She could feel it coming. So what does she do? She prays to God. She asks the question inwardly, what prayer should I pray? And immediately the answer comes to her, change no circumstance in my life, Lord. Change me. And that test that she knew was coming turned out to be the last 20 years of her life. Tremendous illness, tremendous physical suffering, and not something that she could overcome by, you know, will, by creativity, by this, that, the other. I mean, it was a karmic test in a sense, but it was also a blessing for those around her, because she was able to help other people with their karma. And Swamiji referred to this much later, because he came well after that time period, just in the last three and a half years of Master's life. But he had been having this conversation with Yogananda in which they were talking about what it takes to become finally liberated. And Yogananda said, you have to bring 6 disciples very far along the path to a point of realization in themselves before you can be liberated. And this little thought came in his mind, but he said that Gyanamata was liberated. And Yogananda, and it just in Swami's mind, just in the back of his mind, but Yogananda replied to the thought, and he looked and he said, she had disciples. Meaning he was responding to that, saying, yes, she did work with disciples, and she did help disciples to achieve what they could achieve in this lifetime. And it's just, this book is an amazing resource because she's writing letters. A lot of the book is letters that she's written to people. And people write from all over the place, and, with various difficulties, challenges, etc. I mean, the spiritual path is definitely not just tossing rose petals here and there. The rose petals come from roses which have thorns on them and brambles, and there's that aspect of it too. Swami said once that he felt like Divine Mother would, rather than just strewing the path with rose petals, would fill it up with brambles that you have to get off the path so that you can make your way down the path. But there's this grace, I mean, we've both alluded to it, this grace that comes when we open our hearts to it. I'll just share a little story from my own life. The setting was we were relatively new in India. This is circa 2004, around probably May or June. And it was hot in Delhi, and Gurgaon, which is a suburb of Delhi. And we had this little fellow who, the term, Indians here in the audience will know the term chokidar. He was the watchman. He's the fellow who stood by the gate. And, his ostensible purpose was to sort of guard the gate, but he basically just opened the gate and let anybody in. But anyway, he was there as a presence. And he was just a very simple man from a village outside of that area. And he was elderly. And at one point, we had heard him coughing a lot. His little room was just upstairs from the driveway and adjacent to the front door. And, it sounded like he wasn't well. And we had heard that, okay, well, he was going to make a trip back to his village to see the doctor and so forth. And he might have made one trip and then he came back. I don't know. We didn't follow it that closely. He wasn't technically our employee. He was an employee of the owner of the house that we were leasing from. But we were the ones paying him. So, I mean, we were sort of involved in his life. And at one point, then we didn't hear anything more. And so, 12 hours passed. We didn't see him. He didn't come down to work. And we thought, did he go to the village? Nobody saw him go. So finally, myself and another fellow, we went up the stairs to his little room. We opened the door, went in. He was there in the bed, went over to the bed, and he had died. And he had passed away that day or that previous night. And, and we were, I personally was shocked, horrified, oh my God, now what? And and this was a very delicate little situation at that moment because we had a house full of Westerners renting in this suburb in India. There was nothing technically illegal about it, but it was odd. And when it's something like that is odd enough, and it attracts official notice, they can come up with all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't be there, or who are you, and what are you doing, and what about this? And so it was this, and I felt very, very responsible for all of this because I was in charge of that. I went home to Swamiji with this news. It was nighttime. And I just, apart from the shock of, it's the first time I ever found somebody who had died like that. It just was just very surprising and unpleasant. And I went to Swamiji, and he was so sweet, and he was so soothing. He just explained, look, this was his karma. It was his karma to be with us and to serve in this way, and now his life is finished. It's not like it was anybody's fault in particular. There was nothing else we could have done for him. Interestingly, that same night, the other fellow who had come up with me to see what was happening had an experience where this man came to him in the night in an astral way, in a vision sort of way, with a big smile on his face. And he was so happy that he had been able to be there. But the tricky part of this was that we still had to deal with his body. And there was nothing we could do about it. I mean, his villagers, his family had to come and fix this. And, so calls were going back and forth and all this negotiation was happening. And as this was happening, I watched, and they came to bring his body away. And there's a guard walking down the street towards us, just one of the security people from the neighborhood, because the neighborhood was gated. And I'm watching this happen, and it was like, would you guys please close the car and get out of here? Which I couldn't say anything. They didn't even speak Hindi that was understandable. It was more of a dialect. Anyway, and just as they pulled away, this guard came up to the house, and he just kept on walking. There was no issue, but it was like, oh my God, thank you. But I remember thinking, there was this complete surrender on one level, and yet I remember thinking, Master, this is your country, this is your world, and you have to help us navigate this. And many, many times in life, not just myself, all of us at one time or another have faced a situation like Horatio Hornblower. In that book, they described it as this bay was like a cork got stuck in the bottle and they were inside of it and there was no way out. I mean, it's just like you run into situations where I cannot fix this, but Divine Mother, with your grace, something can happen. And all of us in our lives, Swamiji himself as well, many times, he just faced situations where there was no obvious solution. Sometimes it was just a matter of endurance, sometimes it was a matter of creativity, sometimes it was just a matter of waiting for God's grace to come in. But sooner or later that grace does come. So long as we do our part, so long as we work to change ourselves, to be open to God's grace, but especially just to call on that grace, and then it does come. So we'll have an offering.